Well, howdy, Aggies. The purpose of this video is to walk you through how to look at and critique a quantitative data collection research article. So what you can see in front of you is a research article entitled, "Who Knows More About Food Allergies? Restaurant Managerial Staff or Employees?" So I'll start by talking a little bit about just the title. As you saw in the videos in one of the first couple of modules in our class, we know that the title of an article is very important. It gives you some information about what the article is about. So you can see from this title, clearly this is about food allergies, and it's looking about knowledge. So who knows more? Between restaurant managers and staff and employees. Notice that there are a couple of authors here, and you may or may not know this, but generally speaking, the order of authors is by the order of their contribution to the research process or the research itself. So in this case, Yi Li supposedly would have done more work as compared to Errol Sozin. So just a little fun fact. The next thing we'll talk about in the article is the abstract. The abstract is very important because it does give the reader a very short synopsis of the research itself. You can see in this case that the abstract is very, very, very specific and long. Some journals actually put limits on the length of the abstract. Many articles, and you'll see some later on in our class, that don't have things like the purpose and design methodology approach, findings, practical implications, originality values. They don't have those separate sections within the article itself. So they may just combine all of those, and you as a reader would need to be able to distinguish when the author of the abstract kind of switches from talking about why did I do this research to how did I do it to what did I find, and then discussing what they found. Up in the top right-hand corner of this, or excuse me, left-hand corner of this, you can also see received July of 2017. So the authors actually submitted this to the journal in July of 17. It was revised in September of 17 and then accepted a day later. So oftentimes you'll see those dates just so that the readers can know sort of the timeline about how did this get to the journal, how long did it take for them to review it, when were corrections made, and then when was it actually accepted. Before we go into the article itself, I do want to give you a few little pieces of notes. So you might want to get some paper and pencil out and take some notes about this. But from a quantitative perspective, and again, quantitative meaning data that is numerical in nature, generally speaking, we can talk about three different types of research questions. The three are descriptive, relationship, and then difference questions. So descriptive is like the term actually says, it describes something. So those of you who have been through EHRD 391 with me, particularly recently, if you can remember, one of the questions that I've talked about in there quite a bit is, how do Aggies feel about having a fall break? And so that is a descriptive question. So what do Aggies feel about a fall break? And we could put a question mark there. That just describes how students at Texas A&M in any given semester or any given week of the semester feel about having a fall break. It just describes those feelings. The second type of question is relationship question. Again, kind of referring back to what you may have learned in 391 and kind of can remember from that. But is there a relationship between class attendance and test score? So relationship questions look at strength of association between two variables in the situation that I just talked about. Does coming to class, is it related is it associated with how you do on a particular test? And then lastly, difference questions. Difference questions kind of are the final part of our EHRD 391 class. Is there a difference in groups? So an example of that, again, that you may have or may remember from our stat class is there a difference in words memorized when chewing gum versus when not chewing gum? So looking at differences in how many words someone could remember given those two scenarios. Jumping back to descriptive questions, sometimes in looking at the types of questions that an author writes about in a journal article, descriptive questions sometimes will have means and standard deviations, and we'll see some of those in this particular article. And they can also have percentages. So the question I posed was, what do Aggies think about having a fall break? We would give the answer to that as 80% would be in favor of a fall break, 20% would not be in favor of a fall break. In terms of relationship questions, generally speaking there, you'll look at strength of association. So for us, it would be Pearson R. And then for difference questions, particularly what we've talked about with two groups, you would think about seeing things about t-tests, independent t-tests, dependent t-tests, depending on how your groups are. And then certainly following up any results from a t-test by giving means and standard deviations. So jot down some notes about the different types of questions: descriptive, relationship, or difference questions. Something else that we need to talk about and consider before we actually look at this article, and you have read this in the textbook, or should have read this in the textbook prior to looking at this article, but I do want to talk a little bit about sampling. So how does a researcher get participants for his or her research? If you can remember from what you would have read in the textbook, the best way is to random sample or randomly sample to get participants. Generally speaking, a technique for doing this is to put your names in a big pot. So let's say we have 70,000 Aggies and we want to get information from 1,000 of them. We would put 70,000 names in a big pot, and then we would pull out 1,000. So that's called the fishbowl technique. And honestly, we really wouldn't put 70,000 names into a pot and pull it out. We would have probably use some sort of digital version of a fishbowl way of randomly sampling students. But random sampling is the best. Other ways of getting samples are what are referred to as convenience samples. Convenience samples are, an example of that would be if I wanted to get information about what Aggies felt about something, I could conveniently get information from, let's say, face-to-face classes that I have in the fall and spring, because I have people coming into my classroom, and I could, give a survey out to students in the class, and maybe do 5 or 6 of those, maybe 5 or 6 of those across the different disciplines on the campus, different majors, different ages, a freshman class, a sophomore class, a junior class. But a convenient sample means that I conveniently have this group of people, in a classroom that I can get information from. Another way of getting sample is volunteers. This is probably most akin to what you have done with me in 391, where you send a survey out to friends, family, depending on who your sample has to be, in terms of it being anyone or being a college student, let's say. But those people, when you send out a link to a survey, they fill it out, they are volunteering for your research study. So random sampling is the best. Convenience is another method. Volunteers is another method. Let's also talk about the size of the sample. Um, the prevailing thought sometimes when people are not as schooled on how to get good data is that a larger sample is bigger. And I've seen that in numerous studies, um, and talked to numerous people that think, well, if I can get 500 people versus 50, 500 is always going to be better than 50 people. Um, I would disagree with that a little bit because I think the term that you need to latch on to relative to size is that you want your sample to be representative. So if you're trying to uh, generalize back to all Aggies and you think that getting information from 10,000 people is a good sample because it's big, but if that sample is only of freshmen, I would say that if you're generalizing back to all Aggies, getting information from 10,000 people that's only freshmen is not as good as getting 5,000 people where you get a cross section of, let's say, people years in school of the people, different majors. So size isn't as important as the representativeness of your sample. So just a few thoughts on sampling there. And then lastly, before we dig into this article, um, again, I would jot some notes down here. I do want you to understand the difference between two terms. Those terms are limitations and delimitations. So limitations and delimitations. I'll actually start talking about the second item first. Delimitations are the fences that you put around a study. So the fences have to do with what are you measuring, how are you measuring it, who are your participants, um, how many are you going to have, how are you putting them into group. So I'll scroll back up a little bit here. So the fences that are around this study, the delimitations around this study are what we're measuring, the dependent variable, knowledge about food allergies. And as we read the article, we'll see that they actually did measure a few more things other than just who knows more. But there, you can see very clearly this study is delimited to food allergies, knowledge of food allergies. How do people in the restaurant tell restaurateurs about their food allergies? Those types of things. And then the participants here are delimited to restaurant managers or restaurant employees. So in this case, the delimitations are relative to food allergies, and then who is in the study, how are they measuring this? They're sending out a questionnaire. Other studies, they may interview people. Other studies, they may be doing physical measures. So they're measuring stress with biofeedback. They're measuring percent body fat using skin calipers. So all of those items just mentioned are related to the delimitations of the study. Limitations of a study are the weaknesses of a study. All studies are going to have weaknesses. So just like a lot of things in 391, we know that they are not perfect. There is not ever going to be a perfect study. And so as the researcher, as you're collecting data and as you're trying to answer the questions that you've posed, you may see things that come up or recognize things that come up that would be considered a weakness of your study. And so you as the researcher don't just sweep those under the rug, so to speak. You actually talk about them in your in your discussion or conclusion, and you'll see some of those here in this study. So let's get started looking at this study itself, and you do have access to this research article, and so hopefully you have it printed off. If not, you might want to pause and print it off so that you can make some notes as I go through some of the or make some comments about the study itself. So if you think back to the articles that we have, the videos that you have seen already, there are some very distinct parts of a research or data collection research article. R stands for review of literature. Um, and as I've noted, and I believe the video noted, that sometimes review of literature is also called introduction. Introduction slash review of literature is simply the background information needed for your reader to understand your research and your data collection. So if you could think about a triangle, and we think about the base of the triangle being at the bottom of a picture of a triangle and the tip of a triangle being at the top. What I want you to do is invert that picture in your head, or even draw it on a piece of paper, so that the tip of the pyramid is now at the bottom of your picture, and the larger and longer base of the triangle is now at the top of the picture. Because I want you to think about how to write a good introduction slash review of literature. And how do you write that? You use the picture of an inverted triangle. And what that means is, and think about the width of the base. I'm sitting here talking to you with my hands out 2 to 3 feet apart. You write a good introduction by starting with very general information and then slowly narrowing down the focus of your introduction until you get to the very small tip, which very narrowly focuses your intent in your research. So what I've done in the article that we're talking about here is highlighted the first sentence in each of these paragraphs. So the first sentence in their introduction is, a food allergy is an adverse reaction to a specific protein in food. How much more broad can you get about food allergies? I mean, super broad there. So as we work our way down, the authors here then start talking about the foods that are required to be put on labels because they are the most prominent food allergies. So milk, egg, fish, shellfish, etc. So these are foods that are required to be on labels, the major 8, because they account for 90% of food allergies. And then we move on down to the next paragraph. Food allergies affect many aspects of an individual's life. And so it talks a little bit about the cost of having a food allergy, and what it can do to people's pocketbooks and their lives and those types of things. Next sentence, according to a report published by the restaurant industry projected to generate. So now we're moving from information about food allergies to looking at, well, what's going on just in the food service industry. So according to a report published by the food industry is projected to generate, billions of dollars, numbers of employees. And clearly this is in 2017, before the pandemic. So a lot of this information may be slightly or quite different now. But at this time, here's what they knew. So they now are moving from allergies to information about the food service industry. And now we kind of put the two together. Ability to accommodate customers with food allergies has been shown to benefit restaurants. So now we're putting what we know about food allergies, what we know about the food industry, putting them together again, which is narrowing the focus of our study here. So we started out very broad, food allergies. We've narrowed it down. Now, the author then talks about restaurants in general, and now we're linking food allergies and the restaurant business. And then the next sentence, restaurant employees should play an active role in food allergy prevention and management. And so there's a paragraph about that. And so we're like, who in this food industry is really responsible for looking at these issues within the food industry. Next paragraph, employee training is important to improve knowledge and skills, especially because workforce in restaurants often comprise of young employees, some of whom are working their first job. So now they start talking about how training is the most important thing. And so as we go through this article, that is related to knowledge, that is related to everything that is part of this particular study. The last paragraph here before the methodology section, individuals with food allergies are eager to find restaurants that are willing to accommodate their dietary needs. So that's from previous research. So at the bottom now of this inverted triangle, where the tip is, typically is where you see what we'll call the purpose of the study, statement of the problem. A lot of people use interchangeable words there, but at the end of a well-written introduction, at the end of a well-written review of literature, you're going to see what the researcher is doing. This study was conducted to compare managerial staff and employees' attitudes toward food allergies, their food allergy knowledge, and food allergy related training. That's what this article is about. The rest of this talks a little bit about sort of the why they're doing this. Some people would call that the significance of the study. I highlighted the term gap or gaps. Here, the author is talking about there being a gap in the literature. We don't know much about this topic, so that's why this research is important. That's why this research is being conducted. And again, to help restaurants plan and implement policies and trainings related to managing customers with food allergies. So let's move on to the next section. When we get into the results section, you'll see why I chose this study. I will tell you right now, it is not because it has a great methodology section. So in our previous video, we saw review of literature is first thing you need to look for in a good article. M is methodology. Generally speaking, and I would write this down if I were you guys, because you're going to be writing this, or actually you're going to be, or you just wrote this for me. But anyway, we're going to, in our methodology section, have a participant section, an instrument section, and then a procedure section. And those three sections are going to be in your final proposal, research proposal for me. Again, you don't see those in this particular article, but I'll give you plenty of examples of that kind of moving on. I did highlight a few things here. Just the fact that the researchers do talk about their target population, managerial staff, so owners versus managers, and then what they're calling the employees, which they say are front and back house, cooks, hosts, servers working in the restaurants in the U.S. So they do talk about a little bit about who their target population is. They don't give us a lot of information in this first paragraph, which generally, again, is about your participants. The second paragraph does talk a lot about the instrument. So it does talk about how they developed the questionnaire. It talks about the different sections of the questionnaire. So demographic information, we've talked about that a lot in the courses you've had with me. The second section, attitudes toward food allergies using a 5-point. Third section, their knowledge. And then fourth section, kind of how they train in the restaurant for the employees, managers, and true back staff, cooks, etc., on how they do get information to their employees about food allergies. So most of what they actually wrote in their methodology section is actually related to the instrument itself. So it's got the 4 sections. This next paragraph talks about how they established, or next 2 paragraphs talk about how they established the validity and reliability. Again, things that we talked about in 391. They're important to getting good data. So to get good data, to answer your research question, you have to have good instruments. And to have good instruments, you have to be able to say that your instrument was both valid and reliable. Kind of the last part here talks what I would say is maybe starting with where I highlighted descriptive statistics, a little bit maybe about their procedures, kind of not really, but they do talk a little bit about how they're going to analyze their data here. So they're going to look at descriptive statistics. They're going to look at use t-tests. They give you the level of significance. Although I will say, I think they made an error here because I'm pretty sure that this should have been p less than 0.05. I think it was probably a typo for them to actually say the p-value is 0.005. And we'll see later on that they do actually use p less than 0.05. Okay, so we've got our review of literature or our introduction. We've got methodology. Next section that we should be looking for is our results section. And so again, they're just giving demographic information about these two different groups. Notice that the first thing that they're talking about is age. I would say, and if you just had me or have had me quite recently in 391, they have changed age into a categorical variable. So my perspective would have been that they needed to take the ages of their participants and provide a mean and standard deviation for them. They don't do that here. One thing that they do here that is a little different than what I have students do in the demographic section is they're giving demographic information per group. So they give age for managers, age for employees. That's a personal preference, and I sort of dictate that sometimes for my students. Again, my preference would have been not to create this as categorical variables, but to actually just provide means and standard deviations for your participants. We'll see when we get down into the paragraphs below, they do point out sort of where most of the people fall, what age ranges. And again, they're sort of similar for both groups. And then notice that the first number that they give for each of these is the actual number of people. And then they give percentages. And they did have quite a difference in numbers within each of the groups. So 110 managers, 229 employees. So probably the percentages are a little bit more informative here because the actual numbers are a little misleading because of the higher number of people in the employee area. Gender is obviously a categorical variable. Educational, again, categorical, so you can see they've provided it per level of education for each of the groups. I did highlight some stuff in the next, or in the paragraph part of this. If you go above that first table, you'll see that this first paragraph has to do with your managers. The second paragraph, and you can see it highlighted here, is for restaurant employees. They did not put this in the table, but they did provide length of service. And so I highlighted that because they did give means and standard deviations for both of the groups. So you can actually see that both groups had pretty similar length of services in the food industry, and the standard deviations were about the same. So anything you see with the plus and minus after is related to the standard deviation within those groups. Let's move on down, and they gave some more information about their the people in their groups. I'm going to scroll down to table 2, and again, just with these independent restaurants, or were they chains? What types of restaurants were they? Quick service, quick casual. So they gave actually some types of restaurants that would fall into those categories. And then what were some of the strategies that were used when serving customers with food allergies? And you can kind of make a comparison here. And I'll do like in this sections that they do give the list of strategies they could use, but they kind of do put them in order, and it just happens that the strategies used by managers and the strategies used by employees are about the same. So modify the recipes for customers with food allergies was the highest for both groups. 77% of the managers said that they did that. 41% of the employees said that they did that. And then you can work your way down the list. So this table is related to this last paragraph, sort of in the descriptive stuff. And then the next section of our results are attitudes toward food allergies. So I'm going to go ahead and skip down to table 3, and we'll talk a little bit about this. So these were the attitude. These were the attitude questions. And so the first one, and you'll notice that they did find a significant difference between their groups. And the single asterisk tells you that it was less than 0.05. And so that's why I think that there was a typo up a little bit higher where they said the p-value was 0.005. So here is this 0.05. So they did find a significant difference in their groups in the attitude toward it is the customer's responsibility to express their food allergy needs. And what they found was that employees had a higher level of agreement to that statement compared to managers. And so this is saying that the employees think that they strongly agree with that statement that it is the customer's responsibility to express their food allergies. Let me stop just for a moment because I want to talk about hypotheses related to this particular statement. So for each of these statements, we could write both, or not both, but a null hypothesis, a non-directional hypothesis, and a directional hypothesis. So I'm going to give you what the null hypothesis would have been for this particular statement. The null hypothesis would have been there is no difference in attitude toward expressing food allergy of customers expressing food allergy. There is no difference in attitude toward customers expressing their food allergy between managers and employees. So the dependent variable there was the actual attitude of each of these. So there's no difference in attitude about customers expressing their food allergy between managers versus employees. So your independent variable there was the level of your employment, so to speak, where on the manager staff or were you considered but an employee. The non-directional would just change that to there is a difference in attitude toward customers expressing their food allergy for managers versus employees. So you're just saying there is a difference without saying which group would have or strongly agree with that statement more. And then a directional hypothesis for this, and I'll just go by what the findings were, but employees had a higher attitude toward customers expressing their need or their food allergies, had a higher attitude about that or strongly agreed about that compared to managerial staff. So for each of these, we could change that into a null, a non-directional, and to a directional hypothesis. So what we did find here is that there is a significance in the attitudes between the two groups about this statement, and the finding being that employees strongly agreed with that, had a higher percentage of people that agreed with that or strongly agreed with that compared to the managerial staffs. So here are your means and standard deviations for that. They did find a couple of more um, significant differences between the groups. I believe some food allergies indicated by customers are not true. Uh, Strongly agree was a little bit higher, or the degree of agreement was a little bit higher for managers compared to employees. And then lastly, it's the restaurant's responsibility to ask customers about their allergy needs. Again, managers had a higher level of agreement for that to that statement compared to what would be considered the employees. They talk about that down in this paragraph. I think it's interesting. Um, to me, this is sort of a very odd way of kind of globally um, expressing this, but this last statement, the managerial staff did not agree with either of these statements as strongly as the employees did. To me, it's more important to say it in a more positive say that the managers did agree with these statements, as opposed to saying they did not agree as much as. But anyway, again, there's some flaws, I would say, in some are parts of this study, but it's an easy study to read because it gives descriptive stuff, it gives t-tests, so we'll just continue talking about it. The next section talked a little bit about knowledge of food allergies. They started off here giving the mean knowledge scores between the groups. And you can see, just looking at the difference in knowledge, again, the highest score here would have been a 28. And the difference in the group, they say it was not significant. And there are a few others that were not significant. I did highlight the last sentence here. Restaurant employees from quick service restaurants score significantly lower in their knowledge compared to those at casual dining and those at fine dining. And they don't indicate here whether they did multiple t-tests because if you can recall from our discussions in 391, you really don't want to do multiple t-tests because now they have formed three groups: quick service, casual dining, and fine dining restaurants. So again, there's some flaws in the research here, but and they don't talk really about that here, but at least they do talk a little bit about something that is considered, and they could have done an analysis of variance. They're just not talking about it, but they are saying that p-value is less than 0.05. I'm not going to read the next paragraph. I didn't really identify anything in there that they talked about. I do want to talk a little bit about this particular table. Let me see if I can get down to what I want to talk about. I guess I'll start by, let me back up a little bit. Later on down in the paragraph below, they do talk a little bit about the difference in people knowing what is an effective way to combat an allergic reaction, which is the use of an EpiPen. And so there was a significant difference here with more of the employees knowing that fact compared to the managers. And then the managers knew a little bit more about a particular oil that indicates the presence of peanuts. So there is some significance here. But one of the things I did want to point out here, and we talked about this, is these numbers that are like 0.06, 0.08, 0.07, 0.03. And just as a reminder, we don't really want to use terms for 0.06, 0.07, 0.08 as almost significant. We don't want to use uh, terms like, let me see if I can find, or even if we go back up to, uh, you know, point, 000, and there, there's not even a third digit here. We don't really want to say this is highly significant. And so, but they're giving you p-values for each of these. Again, it's indicated down there at the bottom. And then the last part of this just deals with thoughts about and how should we do training. I've kind of gone through most of the results that I personally really want to talk about here, but you can read through this and see what they said. The employees and the manager said about training, benefits of training, those types of things. So let's go down to our very last part, which is our discussion and um, the conclusions. So we've gone through review of literature or introduction, methodology, results, and now we get to our fourth component of a data collection article, discussion. And sometimes you see discussion and conclusions. Here they've got discussion and implications. As a general rule, and again, this would be something that you might critique in an article, and it's very difficult for first-time research writers to do, but what someone should do in their discussion is discuss. What someone should not do in their discussion is restate the results. So there's a little mixed bag here of this. Generally speaking, like you expect to see in the introduction, where you're talking about previous research, so there's a lot of references. What you should see in a very well-written discussion is references to previous research. So the reader should be saying, well, I found this, and this matches what previous research said, or I found this, and this goes against what previous research said. So let me point out a few of the things that I actually have highlighted here. So the very first thing, it just reiterates what the purpose of this is, and that's fine. They're just reminding the reader in this first paragraph of this discussion kind of why they did this. They actually go back and pull in some of the statistics from the introduction and talk about sort of why is this important and why I did this. They do a little bit of reiteration. I'm kind of circling it here with the mouse of what they actually found. So that's sort of kind of a no-no here. I think they're probably doing it because they want the reader to see that here's what we found, and then here's what others found. And so, they're kind of looking at their findings, comparing it to what other researchers found. And so that's probably okay. And then they kind of come up with a conclusion. Hence, restaurants should include as much information about specific allergens as possible on their menus. And so that's fine. What I did nextly, though, is, again, without reading this to you, is I just went through and started highlighting some of the references that they put in here. Because, again, this is their comparing what they found to what other research found. So we'll kind of scroll through this. And, again, I'm going to let you read through this. In this study, overall means of food allergy knowledge from the manager test and was not significant difference. Here's another one where they found, something that was a little bit different maybe than what this research found. I do want to scroll them down so I can kind of get through this article, because the authors do talk. Here's our t-test information. Again, a little bit of a reiteration about what they found. Let's come on down, because the authors here do talk about their limitations. So remember, limitations are the weaknesses of the study, and they talk about them. And so here they talk about how the participants were recruited by the market research company, which is Qualtrics. And so, they kind of say and they used this group because they felt like it would be cast a broader net, so to speak. And it probably did, but it is limited to only those people who, Qualtrics had their information for. And so, that's considered a limitation. Um, the questionnaire didn't ask about geographic limitations, and they point out also that some states have different laws about what has to be on menus. And so that could skew the data slightly, because if the respondents came from some of these states, they're going to have a higher level of standard in terms of what they do put on their menus and how they have to conduct business. So that's another limitation. They didn't really look at English speaking versus non-English speaking. The types of restaurants kind of maybe fall into those categories. And so they give some implications in terms of further research of what can be done. And then lastly, they do finish with their conclusions. And what I've highlighted here at the end is, again, they're kind of going back and justifying, if you will, their research here, because they're talking about where are the gaps. And so their very last statement here is, combined with other evidences with previous research, this study presented opportunities to improve allergy knowledge and training practices among those working in the food service industry or the restaurant industry. So, again, I think the final stuff here is actually pretty good. I'll finish this off by just, again, talking a little bit about the references. And I do want to note, and that this is not good APA. And so, in APA, you will never have volume, edition number, PP. You wouldn't have anything in italics. So there's, don't use this reference list as a thought about what a good reference list should actually look like. So we finished up here. Thanks for listening. You will have an article test coming up, and elements of what we've talked about or I've talked about in this will be on that. So good luck on that test, and thanks for listening.